A husband and wife took their infant daughter on a trip into the towering redwood forests, but the family disappeared without a trace. An exhaustive search turned up nothing, and the case fell into a 4-year silence, becoming another tragic local legend, until a team of mycology students documented a strange growth at the base of a tree. A finding that would unravel a horrific truth hidden just beneath the surface. The calls to Serena Quaid's cell phone began not with panic, but with mild irritation. It was late August 2013, and Odelia Hastings expected her daughter to have checked in hours ago. Serena, 32, her husband, Kane Van Craftoft, 33, and their 6-month-old daughter, Ella, were due back from a 3-day trip exploring the towering groves of the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. They were experienced travelers, Kaylin especially, and the itinerary was supposed to be relaxed, easy trails suitable for a baby in a carrier. Yet the evening wore on and the scheduled call never came. Odelia tried Serena's phone again. It went straight to voicemail. She tried Kaylin's. The same result. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in Odelia's chest. This wasn't like them. Even when traveling in areas with patchy reception, they always found a way to send a text or make a brief call, prioritizing communication precisely because they had ESA with them. The silence stretching from the remote northern coast felt heavy and unnatural. By the following morning, the irritation had fully calcified into fear. Odelia Hastings contacted the local police department, explaining that her daughter and son-in-law were significantly overdue and unreachable. The report was taken and the information was relayed to the authorities managing the jurisdiction covering the vast expanse of the Redwood Parks. Investigators began the preliminary steps of tracing the family's movements. They learned that Kaylin and Serena were a vibrant, active couple. Kaylin worked in environmental consulting and possessed a deep knowledge of wilderness safety and navigation. Serena, a graphic designer, was more cautious by nature, especially since Isalla's birth, but trusted Kaylin's expertise implicitly. Their trip was meant to be an introduction for Ella to the ancient forests. Kaylin loved the itinerary they left behind was casual, focusing on the most accessible scenic routes and well-maintained trails. They had not packed a satellite phone, assuming it unnecessary for such casual hikes. The first concrete piece of information came from the digital realm. Recognizing that the couple likely took photos, investigators requested access to their cloud storage accounts. In 2013, automatic uploads depended entirely on finding a signal. As investigators combed through the recent activity, they found something. A single photograph had synced 2 days prior, timestamped around midday. The image instantly became the centerpiece of the investigation. It showed Kaylin, Serena, and Isa standing on a wide, light brown dirt trail dwarfed by the immense straight trunks of the redwoods surrounding them. The lighting was soft, filtered by the dense canopy high above. Kaylin, recognizable by his shaved head and light beard, was smiling broadly. He wore a muted green t-shirt and beige shorts, the straps of a backpack visible over his shoulders. Strapped to his chest in a dark gray carrier, was her face turned toward the camera, adorned with a distinctive pink headband featuring a small bow. To his right stood Serena, her long dark hair framing a warm smile. She was dressed in a vibrant blue t-shirt and dark blue leggings, a matching blue fanny pack slung around her waist. Her arm was wrapped around Kaylin's back, her other hand resting protectively on the baby carrier. It was a picture of idyllic happiness, but in the context of their disappearance, it felt haunting. Metadata embedded in the file confirmed the location near a popular scenic route within the park system. Analyzing the angle and framing of the shot, investigators quickly concluded that the photo was not a selfie. The perspective suggested the phone had been handed to a third party, another hiker who happened upon them. This realization presented 2 immediate imperatives. Locate the physical starting point of their hike and identify the person who took the picture. The first task was straightforward. Utilizing the location data, park rangers quickly located the trailhead corresponding to the photo. There, parked neatly in the designated area was the family's vehicle. It was locked, undisturbed, and showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The presence of the car suggested they had embarked on their hike as planned and intended to return, but they never did. The Van Quaid family had seemingly stepped onto that trail and vanished into the ancient forest. The discovery of the vehicle mobilized a massive response. The Redwood National and State Parks are not just a collection of trees. They are a sprawling complex ecosystem covering over 139,000 acres. The terrain is characterized by steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and trees so massive they create a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. For search and rescue teams, it is one of the most challenging environments in North America. The initial strategy was saturation. Dozens of professional searchers, K-9 units, and volunteers were deployed, starting from the trailhead and fanning outwards. The difficulty of the operation became immediately apparent. The dense canopy hundreds of feet high rendered aerial searches by helicopter nearly useless, obscuring any view of the ground. On the ground, visibility was often limited to mere yards. The forest floor, carpeted with centuries of fallen needles and debris, made tracking footprints incredibly difficult, even for experienced trackers. Odelia Hastings arrived at the hastily established command center near the trailhead. The agonizing uncertainty was etched on her face. She along with Kalen's family provided investigators with critical details about the couple's gear, their hiking habits, and their personalities. Odelia was adamant that Kalen, despite his adventurous spirit, was meticulous when it came to safety. He would never, she insisted, take reckless risks with Serena, and especially not with 6-month-old Isla. She described the specific brand of the baby carrier, the color of the blanket they always kept with Isla, and the contents of the backpack Kalen was likely carrying: standard day hike supplies, water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, but nothing intended for overnight survival. The search continued for days, then weeks. Teams meticulously covered the main trail where the photo was taken, pushing miles in every direction. They also began the arduous process of searching off-trail areas, battling thickets of huckleberry and massive ferns. The scale of the environment was overwhelming. It was entirely possible for a person to be just 50 feet off the trail and remain completely invisible. Despite the exhaustive efforts, the search yielded nothing. No dropped water bottle, no fibers from clothing caught on a branch, no sign of a struggle, no discarded diaper. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. Investigators turned their attention back to the only witness they knew existed, the photographer. The hope was that this individual might remember which direction the family headed after the photo was taken, or perhaps recall something unusual about their demeanor. Identifying a random hiker in a popular tourist destination was a formidable task. Investigators circulated the image, hoping the person might recognize themselves or that someone else might identify the family and recall seeing the interaction. Weeks into the investigation, the breakthrough came. The individual was identified as a tourist from Germany who had already returned home. Through international cooperation, authorities contacted him. The man vividly recalled the encounter. He remembered the happy couple and the baby with the pink headband. He confirmed they had briefly chatted about the beauty of the grove. He offered to take the photo and then they parted ways. Crucially, he stated that the family continued down the main established trail. He saw nothing suspicious, no one following them, nothing out of the ordinary. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into mundane reality. As the physical search stalled, investigators began exploring other possibilities. The wilderness holds more dangers than just the elements. A month into the search, a specialized tracking team operating deep in an off-limits protected section of the park detected signs of recent disturbance. It wasn't related to the missing family, but it was significant. The agonizing uncertainty was etched on her face. She along with Kalen's family provided investigators with critical details about the couple's gear, their hiking habits, and their personalities. Odelia was adamant that Kalen, despite his adventurous spirit, was meticulous when it came to safety. He would never, she insisted, take reckless risks with Serena, and especially not with 6-month-old Isla. She described the specific brand of the baby carrier, the color of the blanket they always kept with Isla, and the contents of the backpack Kalen was likely carrying: standard day hike supplies, water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, but nothing intended for overnight survival. The search continued for days, then weeks. Teams meticulously covered the main trail where the photo was taken, pushing miles in every direction. They also began the arduous process of searching off-trail areas, battling thickets of huckleberry and massive ferns. The scale of the environment was overwhelming. It was entirely possible for a person to be just 50 feet off the trail and remain completely invisible. Despite the exhaustive efforts, the search yielded nothing. No dropped water bottle, no fibers from clothing caught on a branch, no sign of a struggle, no discarded diaper. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. Investigators turned their attention back to the only witness they knew existed, the photographer. The hope was that this individual might remember which direction the family headed after the photo was taken, or perhaps recall something unusual about their demeanor. Identifying a random hiker in a popular tourist destination was a formidable task. Investigators circulated the image, hoping the person might recognize themselves or that someone else might identify the family and recall seeing the interaction. Weeks into the investigation, the breakthrough came. The individual was identified as a tourist from Germany who had already returned home. Through international cooperation, authorities contacted him. The man vividly recalled the encounter. He remembered the happy couple and the baby with the pink headband. He confirmed they had briefly chatted about the beauty of the grove. He offered to take the photo and then they parted ways. Crucially, he stated that the family continued down the main established trail. He saw nothing suspicious, no one following them, nothing out of the ordinary. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into mundane reality. As the physical search stalled, investigators began exploring other possibilities. The wilderness holds more dangers than just the elements. A month into the search, a specialized tracking team operating deep in an off-limits protected section of the park detected signs of recent disturbance. It wasn't related to the missing family, but it was significant. By early afternoon, they decided to take a break near a large aging oak tree situated in a small clearing amidst the towering redwoods. Oak trees were less common in this specific area, making it a notable landmark for their research. As they settled down, shedding their heavy packs and retrieving their lunches, Xander Zeller noticed something unusual at the base of the oak. His eyes, trained to spot subtle variations in the forest floor ecology, were drawn to a bizarre amorphous mass nestled against the tree's roots. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of fieldwork. The growth was large, perhaps 3 feet across, and startlingly colored. It was a chaotic mix of bright sulfurous yellow and stark white with patches of deep oily black that looked as if soil or decaying matter had been incorporated into the structure. The texture was lumpy, porous, and wetted-looking, almost resembling chemical foam that had been spilled and solidified rather than a natural fungal growth. It looked alien against the dark, damp earth and the reddish-brown bark of the tree. Curiosity piqued. Zaire stood up and approached the mass. As he drew closer, the visual strangeness was accompanied by a distinct, unsettling odor. The forest floor usually smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the sweet scent of decay. But this was different. It was a sharp, pungent, and deeply putrid smell that cut through the ambient forest air. It was the unmistakable smell of advanced decomposition, but amplified and concentrated. Zaire called the other students over. They were equally fascinated and repulsed. They spent several minutes examining the growth, discussing its potential origins. Was it a massive slime mold? A reaction to some environmental toxin? They took numerous high-resolution photographs documenting the mass from every angle, capturing the strange coloration and texture against the backdrop of the forest floor. After thoroughly documenting the anomaly, the group shouldered their packs and continued on to their next research grid, the strange encounter lingering in their minds. That evening, back at a remote research outpost station maintained by the Park Service, the group was reviewing their findings. They showed the photographs to a resident park botanist who was stationed there for the season. The botanist was stunned by the images. He remarked on the sheer size and the vibrant unnatural coloration. Based on the visual evidence and Zayer's description of the intense odor, the botanist offered a hypothesis. The growth was likely the result of decomposition gases from a large buried animal, perhaps a bear or an elk, fueling an extreme localized fungal bloom. The nutrients released during decomposition combined with a specific environmental conditions could create such an anomaly. This explanation resonated with the group. If a large animal carcass was indeed buried there, the decomposition process and its impact on the surrounding fungal ecology presented a unique research opportunity. It was a chance to document a rarely observed phenomenon. Driven by this scientific curiosity, Zeller and his team decided to return to the site the next day. They equipped themselves with sampling tools, core samplers, and the compact survival shovels they carried for fieldwork. The hike back to the oak tree was focused and swift. When they arrived, the fungal mass was unchanged, the pungent odor hanging heavily in the air. They began their work methodically. The plan was to take soil samples from around the mass and then carefully excavate a small section to determine the source of the nutrients. Zayer began digging at the edge of the growth. The soil was loose, making the initial digging easy. As he dug deeper, the stench intensified rapidly, becoming almost overwhelming. They had to take turns digging, the odor forcing them to step back for fresh air. A few feet down, Zeller's shovel struck something resilient. It wasn't the resistance of a root or a rock, but something that yielded slightly under the pressure. He cleared the loose dirt away. It was a sheet of heavy-duty black plastic. It wasn't a natural part of the forest floor. The realization that this was not a buried animal hit the group instantly. The atmosphere shifted from scientific curiosity to apprehension. They continued digging, now with a sense of urgency. They uncovered more of the plastic, realizing it was a large tarp. It appeared to be layered multiple times, suggesting a deliberate effort to seal whatever was inside. The implications were ominous. This was a clandestine burial. Working together, they managed to clear enough dirt to expose a significant section of the tarp. Using a field knife, Zayer carefully cut through the layers of plastic. The moment the seal was broken, the concentrated odor of decomposition rushed out. Peering into the opening, they saw not the fur of an animal, but the heavily decomposed remains of a human adult. The discovery was jarring. The students immediately stopped the excavation. The reality of their situation, deep in the wilderness, standing over a hidden grave, was overwhelming. Zeller retrieved the satellite phone from his pack and with shaking hands contacted the authorities, reporting the discovery of human remains in one of the most remote sections of the park. The coordinates provided by Xander Zeller directed authorities to a location far from any established trail system. The logistical challenge of reaching the site was significant. A specialized forensic team had to be airlifted as close as possible and then hiked for several hours through the rugged terrain carrying heavy equipment. The isolation that had kept the grave hidden for years now complicated the investigation. When the team arrived, they found the scene exactly as the students had described it, the bizarre vibrant fungal growth contrasting sharply with the disturbed earth and the exposed section of black tarp. The students who had remained nearby as instructed were interviewed by the initial responding officers. They recounted the discovery, emphasizing the scientific curiosity that led them to dig and the shock of finding human remains. The forensic team began the meticulous process of securing the scene. The remote location required them to establish a perimeter and work under field conditions, battling the damp environment and the overwhelming odor emanating from the grave. The excavation was slow and methodical. Every layer of soil was sifted, every piece of potential evidence catalogued. The strange fungal growth was carefully documented and sampled, recognized as a byproduct of the decomposition process occurring beneath it. The excavation revealed the full extent of the burial. The body was tightly wrapped in multiple layers of heavy-duty black tarp sealed with a thoroughness that suggested time and deliberation. This was not a hasty burial. It was a calculated disposal. After several hours of painstaking work, the body, still encased in the tarp, was removed from the grave and prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office. The initial assessment at the scene confirmed the remains were those of an adult male, but the identity remained unknown. The news of the discovery rippled through the region, reaching Odelia Hastings. The discovery of a body in the Redwoods inevitably raised the painful possibility that it might be connected to the disappearance of her family 4 years earlier. The uncertainty was agonizing. At the medical examiner's office, the process of identification began. The advanced state of decomposition made visual identification impossible. The remains were largely skeletonized with some preserved tissue remaining within the anaerobic environment created by the tarp. Dental records were requested for all long-term missing persons associated with the area, including Kaylin Van Craftoft. The comparison yielded a definitive match. The remains were confirmed to be those of Kaylin Van Craftoft. For years after he vanished, Kaylin had been found. The discovery was a devastating blow to his family and to Odelia Hastings. It confirmed their worst fears, but also shattered the previous theories about the family getting lost or falling victim to the elements. Kaylin had been deliberately buried, hidden deep in the wilderness. This strongly suggested foul play was involved, at least in the disposal of his body. But the discovery raised a terrifying new question. Where were Serena and Isla? The grave contained only Kaylin's remains. There was no sign of his wife or their baby daughter. The mystery deepened, taking a darker turn. The autopsy commenced, presenting significant challenges due to the condition of the remains. The medical examiner meticulously examined the skeleton for any signs of trauma. There were no gunshot wounds, no evidence of stabbing, no fractures indicative of blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone was intact. The cause of death was initially undetermined. This paradox was baffling. The clandestine burial strongly suggested concealment. Yet, the remains showed no signs of violence. How did Kaylin die? And why would someone go to such lengths to hide his body if the death was accidental or natural? Investigators were left with a scenario that made little sense. If Kaylin had died accidentally, why didn't Serena seek help? If she was involved in the burial, it seemed physically impossible for her to have dug the grave herself, especially while caring for a 6-month-old baby. Furthermore, where would she have obtained heavy-duty black tarp in the middle of the wilderness? The evidence pointed towards the involvement of a third party, but the lack of trauma on Kaylin's body complicated the narrative of a violent abduction. Faced with the absence of a clear cause of death, the medical examiner ordered specialized toxicological screening. This was a complex and time-consuming process involving the analysis of bone marrow and the decomposition fluids that had been trapped within the tarp. These fluids, essentially a concentrated byproduct of the body's breakdown, might hold chemical clues that had been preserved. Weeks later, the results came back and they were startling. The analysis detected highly concentrated compounds of *Cryalis venom, rattlesnake venom. The levels were significant, suggesting a severe envenomation shortly before death. The revelation was shocking. Rattlesnakes, while present in Northern California, are exceedingly rare in the deep shade and cool temperatures of the redwood forests. They prefer drier, warmer environments. Investigators consulted with herpetologists who confirmed that while not impossible, a fatal encounter in this specific ecosystem was highly unusual. The snake bite explanation offered a plausible cause of death that aligned with the lack of trauma on the remains. The working theory shifted dramatically. Investigators hypothesized that Kaylin might have been bitten by a rattlesnake while hiking. Given the potency of the venom and their remote location, the bite could have been fatal within hours. But this theory still failed to explain the burial or the disappearance of Serena and Isa. If Kaylin died from a snake bite, what happened next? The discovery of the venom provided a partial answer to how Kaylin died, but it intensified the mystery surrounding the fate of his wife and child. The investigation shifted dramatically. The snake bite explained Kaylin's death, but it strongly suggested the involvement of a third party in the aftermath. Someone else had been there. Someone else had access to the tarp. Someone else had buried Kalin. The investigation was no longer just about finding missing hikers. It was about reconstructing a complex and terrifying sequence of events that began with a fatal encounter with a snake and ended with a hidden grave. With the realization that a third party was involved in the burial of Kalin Van Craftoft, the investigation turned its focus to the physical evidence found at the grave site. The remote location, while initially a hindrance, now became a crucial element of the investigation. Someone had chosen that spot deliberately. Forensic teams analyzed the documentation of the burial site. The excavation had revealed that the burial was not rushed. The grave was dug with care, deep enough to avoid easy discovery by animals or casual observation. The body was wrapped methodically in the tarp, suggesting the person involved had time and was not panicked. This indicated that the burial likely occurred shortly after Kalin's death by someone who felt secure in that location. The most significant piece of evidence was the black tarp itself. It was the one element that didn't belong in the wilderness, the one thing that connected the grave to the outside world. The layers of plastic were analyzed meticulously for trace evidence. In the environment of the grave, the tarp had acted as a barrier, preserving not only the decomposition fluids, but also any particles that might have been adhered to it before the burial. The forensic analysis of the tarp yielded specific and unusual trace evidence embedded in the fibers of the plastic and mixed with the soil found on the outer layers. Investigators found microscopic particles of a specific type of volcanic rock dust. This geological signature was significant as volcanic soil deposits were localized within the vast expanse of the region and not present at the burial site itself. The volcanic dust suggested the tarp had been stored or used in a location with a different soil composition. In addition to the dust, the analysis detected traces of aged diesel fuel. The presence of diesel suggested the tarp might have been associated with machinery, vehicles, or a storage area where fuel was kept. These two elements, volcanic dust and diesel fuel, provided the first tangible clues about the origin of the tarp. Investigators also focused on the material of the tarp itself. It was identified as a specific grade of high-durability UV-resistant plastic, not the typical lightweight material sold in camping stores. This was industrial-grade material used primarily for heavy equipment covering construction sites or agricultural use. The investigators began the painstaking process of tracing the manufacturing and distribution of this specific type of tarp. They discovered that this particular batch, identified by its chemical composition and texture, was sold only through a few specialized rural supply outlets in the surrounding counties. The investigation now had three distinct vectors. The geographic distribution of the volcanic soil, the locations where diesel fuel might be present, and the outlets that sold the specific tarp. The challenge was to find the intersection of these three elements. A massive mapping project was initiated. Investigators began by mapping the geological surveys of the region, identifying areas characterized by the specific volcanic soil deposits found on the tarp. They then cross-referenced this information with satellite imagery and decades-old property records. They were looking for remote properties, homesteads, or industrial sites located within a drivable radius of the burial site. The presence of diesel suggested they should focus on properties with vehicles or heavy equipment, particularly those accessible via old logging roads or unmaintained tracks. This was not a quick process. The region surrounding the Redwood National and State Parks is sparsely populated, characterized by isolated homesteads, old logging camps, and properties whose owners valued privacy and seclusion. The mapping project generated dozens of potential locations that matched at least some of the criteria. While the forensic and geographical analysis continued, the human element of the tragedy remained central. Odelia Hastings had to process the discovery of Kalin's remains and the bizarre cause of death. The confirmation of his death was devastating, ending 4 years of uncertainty, but confirming her worst fears. The explanation of the snake bite provided little comfort. To Odelia, the fact that Kalin had been buried secretly only reinforced her belief that something terrible had happened to Serena and Ella. If Kalin's death was an accident, why hadn't the person who buried him come forward? Why hadn't they helped Serena and Ella? The investigation was now operating under the assumption that Serena and Isella might still be alive, perhaps held captive, or that they had been murdered and disposed of separately. The pressure to identify the origin of the TARP was immense. The painstaking work of the mapping project was narrowing the field, moving the investigation from the vast wilderness to the isolated pockets of human habitation hidden within it. The intersection of the volcanic dust, the diesel fuel, and the agricultural TARP was leading investigators toward a specific area, a place where the secrets of the past 4 years might be hidden. The mapping project, integrating geological data, trace evidence analysis, and supply chain information, began to yield actionable intelligence. The dozens of isolated properties identified were prioritized based on how closely they matched the profile derived from the evidence. Investigators began the systematic process of visiting these locations. Given the sensitive nature of the investigation and the independent, often suspicious nature of the residents in these remote areas, the approach had to be cautious. They couldn't simply arrive and start asking questions about a 4-year-old disappearance and a hidden grave. The investigators often operated under the pretext of routine fire safety compliance checks or illegal cultivation surveys, common reasons for law enforcement presence in the region. This allowed them to assess the residents, observe the premises, and look for the specific elements identified in the investigation without raising suspicion. They visited old logging camps, isolated cabins, and off-grid homesteads. At each location, they looked for rolls of the specific black agricultural TARP, signs of heavy equipment, and the presence of diesel storage. They also took discrete soil samples for comparison with the volcanic dust found at the grave. The investigation eventually focused on a property situated about 8 miles from Kalen's grave. This property was located in an area characterized by the specific volcanic soil identified in the forensic analysis. It was accessible only via a rough unmaintained track that cut through the dense forest, making it extremely isolated. The property was owned by Juan Yarrow, a man in his late 50s. Local records indicated that Yarrow lived alone and had owned the property for decades. Interviews with locals in the nearest small town painted a picture of Yarrow as an eccentric and sometimes volatile recluse. He was known to live entirely off-grid, rarely coming into town for supplies, and fiercely protective of his privacy. 2 detectives were assigned to conduct the initial visit to Yarrow's homestead. The drive itself was challenging, the unmaintained track requiring a high-clearance vehicle. As they approached the property, the sense of isolation was profound. The homestead was a collection of structures built over time, a main cabin, several outbuildings, and sheds. The property was cluttered with old machinery, rusting vehicles, and various debris. It had an unkempt, almost feral atmosphere. The detectives approached the main cabin and announced their presence. Yarrow emerged. He was a weathered man dressed in worn workclothes, his expression immediately defensive and hostile. He questioned the detectives' presence on his property, demanding to know why they were there. The detectives stuck to their pretext of a fire safety compliance check, explaining they were surveying all properties in the area due to the high fire risk. Yarrow was uncooperative, answering questions with monosyllabic replies and complaining about government intrusion. While one detective engaged Yarrow in conversation, the other carefully observed the surroundings. The ground around the homestead was characterized by the distinctive reddish-brown volcanic soil. Then the detective spotted what they were looking for. Near one of the larger outbuildings, there was a dilapidated tractor partially covered by a large sheet of black plastic. The material appeared identical in texture and weight to the TARP found at the grave. Nearby, there was an old diesel tank stained with years of use. Several large rolls of the same black TARP were stacked against the side of the shed. The presence of the matching TARP, the diesel residue from the tank and the tractor, and the soil composition aligning perfectly with the trace evidence found at the grave provided the investigators with the probable cause they needed. They concluded the interview with Yarrow, apologizing for the intrusion and left the property. As soon as they were out of sight, they reported their findings to the command center. The decision was made to secure a search warrant for the entire property. Given Yarrow's volatility and the remote location, the execution of the warrant had to be carefully planned. Investigators monitored the property covertly for the next 48 hours using long-range observation and aerial surveillance to confirm that Yarrow remained on the property and lived alone. They needed to ensure there were no other individuals present who might complicate the operation. The search warrant was granted. A tactical team was assembled. The plan was to execute the warrant early in the morning, utilizing the element of surprise to detain Yarrow before he had a chance to react or destroy evidence. The raid commenced before dawn. The tactical team moved quickly and quietly down the long track leading to the homestead. They converged on the property simultaneously from multiple directions, securing the perimeter and approaching the main cabin. The element of surprise was crucial. They breached the cabin door and found Yarrow inside. He was detained without incident, seemingly resigned to the inevitability of the situation. He was secured in handcuffs and removed from the cabin while the search began. The extensive search of the property commenced immediately. The forensic teams began processing the area where the tarp and the tractor were located, taking samples for definitive comparison with the evidence from the grave. The search of the main cabin began. The interior was disorganized, cluttered with years of accumulated possessions, reflecting Yarrow's reclusive lifestyle. The initial search of the living areas yielded nothing immediately connecting him to the missing family. There were no obvious signs that Serena or EA had ever been in the cabin. The search continued for hours, expanding to the outbuildings and the surrounding area. The investigators were looking for any trace of the missing woman and child, clothing, personal belongings, or grimly, other burial sites. The homestead was large, and the clutter made the search slow and difficult. The anticipation was high, the investigators certain they were in the right place, but the lack of immediate discovery of further evidence began to create a tense atmosphere. The question lingered. If this was where the tarp originated, what else was hidden here? The search of Juan Yarrow's property stretched into the afternoon. The forensic teams had confirmed that the black tarp found near the tractor was an exact match to the material used to wrap Kalen Van Craftoff's body. The soil samples taken from the homestead also matched the volcanic dust found at the grave site. The evidence connecting Yarrow to the burial was overwhelming. Yet, the central mystery remained. Where were Serena and Isa? The search teams had meticulously gone through the outbuildings, finding nothing but old tools, supplies, and more debris. The surrounding area had been surveyed for any signs of disturbed soil that might indicate other graves with negative results. The focus returned to the main cabin. The investigators began a more intrusive search of the structure itself, looking for hidden compartments or anomalies. It was late in the afternoon when an investigator noticed an irregularity in the flooring of the main cabin. The wooden planks in a corner of the kitchen area seemed slightly raised and the spacing between them was uneven. They pulled back a worn rug that covered the area. Beneath it, they discovered a distinct outline in the flooring, a hidden access panel. It was secured with screws that appeared to have been removed and replaced multiple times. The access panel was carefully removed, revealing a dark opening leading beneath the cabin. A ladder descended into the darkness. The air rising from the opening was cold, damp, and carried the faint, unsettling odor of mildew and something else, something familiar from the excavation of Kalen's grave. With weapons drawn, the investigators descended into the opening. It led to a small cold-root cellar dug directly into the earth beneath the structure. The space was cramped, the ceiling low, the walls lined with rough wooden shelves holding jars of preserved food. The light from their flashlights cut through the gloom. In the far corner of the cellar, the forensic team made a horrific discovery. Partially buried in the dirt floor, concealed under a pile of old burlap sacks, were human remains. The decomposition was advanced, mostly skeletal. The excavation began immediately, the small space making the process even more difficult than the recovery of Kalen's body. The remains were identified quickly. The clothing fragments found with the body matched the description of what Serena Quaid was wearing when she disappeared. Dental records later confirmed the identification. Serena had been found. The discovery of Serena's body confirmed the darkest theories of the investigation. The examination of the scene in the root cellar indicated a violent end. There was evidence suggesting she had been restrained. The autopsy later confirmed the cause of death. The hyoid bone was fractured, indicating she had died from strangulation. The discovery of Serena's body answered one question, but intensified the urgency of another. What happened to baby Isa? There was no sign of the infant's remains in the root cellar or anywhere else on the property. However, the investigators found other items in the cellar that connected back to the disappearance. In a corner hidden behind a stack of crates, they found a small mildewed bag. Inside, they discovered the blue fanny pack that Serena was seen wearing in the last photo. It still contained her wallet and identification. Along with the fanny pack, they found a small bundle of baby clothing and a distinct handcrafted blanket. The items confirmed that Isella had also been at the homestead. €1 was formally arrested and transported to the county jail. He had remained silent throughout the search, his expression inscrutable. Now confronted with the discovery of Serena's remains on his property and the evidence connecting him to Kaylin's burial, the interrogation began. The interrogation room was small and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaotic environment of Euro's homestead. The detectives presented the evidence methodically, laying out the connection between the tarp, the soil, and the bodies. Euro initially denied any knowledge of the disappearance, claiming the remains must have been there before he owned the property, a claim easily disproven by the timeline. The interrogation continued for hours. The detectives pressed on Euro, emphasizing the gravity of the situation and the inevitability of his conviction. Eventually, his stoic demeanor began to crack. The weight of the evidence and the isolation of the interrogation room broke through his defenses. He began to talk. Over the next several hours, Wayne Euro confessed, providing a detailed account of the events that transpired in August 2013. His story was a chilling narrative of tragic accident followed by opportunistic violence. According to Euro, late in the evening on the day the family disappeared, he was in his cabin heavily intoxicated. He heard a noise outside, a frantic shouting. He went to investigate and found a woman stumbling onto his property. It was Serena. She was carrying a baby, Isela. She was lost, hysterical, and desperate for help. Serena explained that they had been hiking and decided to go off trail to find a secluded spot to rest and feed the baby. While they were resting, Kaylin had accidentally sat down on a rattlesnake that was concealed in the undergrowth. The snake had bitten him multiple times. Kaylin had gone into shock rapidly. Serena, inexperienced in the wilderness and terrified, tried to help him, but he quickly became unresponsive. They had no satellite phone and no cell service. Serena realized she needed to find help. She took the baby and started walking, trying to find a trail or a road. She had become disoriented and lost, wandering in the dark for several hours before she stumbled upon Euro's homestead. Euro claimed that upon hearing her story, he agreed to help. He took his rifle and a flashlight and followed Serena back into the woods. She led him to the area where Kaylin lay. When they arrived, Euro checked Kaylin. He was already deceased. The signs of the snake bite were evident, swelling and discoloration around the wounds. It was at this moment, according to Euro, that his intentions shifted. He was drunk, isolated, and recognized the opportunity presented by the situation. Serena was alone, lost, and desperate. No one knew where she was. No one would connect her disappearance to his remote property. Instead of using the satellite phone he possessed at his property to call for help, he made a dark decision. He forced Serena and the baby back to his cabin at gunpoint. He held them captive overnight. In his confession, Euro admitted to sexually assaulting Serena in the cabin. The root cellar, accessible from inside the cabin, was where he restrained her. The next day, when Euro sobered up, he realized the gravity of his actions. He had kidnapped and assaulted a woman. He knew that if he let her go, she would report him to the authorities. He made the decision to cover up his crimes. He murdered Serena in the root cellar, strangling her, and then concealed her body under the dirt floor. With Serena dead, Euro then had to deal with Kaylin's body. He took a roll of the black agricultural tarp from his supplies and hiked back to the area where Kaylin lay. He wrapped the body meticulously in the tarp and buried him near where he died, choosing the spot near the oak tree for its isolation. He dug a deep grave to ensure the body would not be discovered. He believed that if the bodies were never found, he would never be caught. Yo's confession explained the bizarre circumstances of the case, the snake bite, the clandestine burial, and the disappearance of Serena and Isla. It was a narrative of a tragic accident intersecting with human depravity. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth about what happened to Kaylin and Serena, but one crucial question remained unanswered, hanging heavy in the sterile air of the interrogation room. What happened to the baby? When the detectives pressed Euro about the fate of baby Isa, his response was unexpected. He insisted that despite the brutality of his actions against Serena, he couldn't bring himself to harm the infant. He claimed that after the murders, he was left with the 6-month-old baby unsure of what to do. He didn't want another death on his conscience, but he couldn't keep the child. According to Euro, in the days following the murders, he made a drastic decision. He claimed he packed supplies, took the baby, and drove south. He stated he crossed the border into Mexico and traveled deep into the country to a small town in the state of Oaxaca. There, he relinquished the baby to a local orphanage, providing false information about her identity, claiming she was the child of a relative who could no longer care for her. Investigators were immediately skeptical of this claim. It seemed too convenient, a self-serving attempt to mitigate the monstrosity of his crimes. However, they were obligated to investigate the possibility that Isa might still be alive. They began the complex process of attempting to verify Euro's story. They uncovered evidence that supported part of his account. Border crossing data and receipts found at his homestead confirmed that Euro did indeed travel deep into Mexico shortly after the murders in 2013. He had been gone for nearly 2 weeks. Furthermore, the handcrafted blanket found in the root cellar with Isela's clothing was analyzed. It was identified as a style specific to the region of Oaxaca that Euro had mentioned. This suggested he might have acquired the blanket during his trip. Perhaps intending to leave it with the baby. Despite this corroborating evidence, the trail for Isa in Mexico was complex. The passage of 4 years, the lack of accurate records in the rural orphanage system, and the false information provided by Euro made the search exceedingly difficult. International authorities were involved, but the efforts to locate a child matching Isa's description yielded no definitive results. Euro was charged with the murders of Serena Quaid along with kidnapping and sexual assault and the improper disposal of Kaylin Van Krafthoff's body. He pleaded guilty, avoiding a trial, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case was officially closed with Euro's conviction. Kaylin and Serena had finally been found. Their fate revealed after years of mystery. But for Odelia Hastings, the resolution was incomplete. While there was evidence suggesting that Isla was alive, her location and identity remained unconfirmed. The mystery of what happened to the baby lost in the Redwoods lingered, a final unresolved question in a case defined by tragedy and deception.